Attention, brave souls. What you're about to witness might make your heart race. Before the suspense takes over your screen, click subscribe now and hit the like button. Get ready for a spine-chilling experience. But be warned, only the boldest will survive until the end.
Hello, my name is Michael Carter. I'm 45 years old, and I've spent the better part of 2 decades as a wilderness guide, taking people into some of the most remote and unforgiving landscapes on Earth. For me, the wilderness has always been a place of solace, a wild cathedral where the beauty of nature meets its relentless, untamed power. But sometimes, it's easy to forget how small and vulnerable we really are out there. Sometimes, the wilderness reminds us in ways we never expect. This happened in the summer of 2019 in Alaska, near Denali National Park. I'd taken a small group of tourists, 3 strangers eager for adventure, on a guided trek deep into the wild. There was Marcus, a brash outdoorsman who fancied himself an expert in survival, Emma, a folklore enthusiast with a fascination for local legends, and Claire, a quiet, nervous woman who was clearly out of her element. From the start, something about this trip felt off. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Normally, the Alaskan wilderness is alive with sound. Birds calling, the rustle of animals moving through the underbrush, the distant howl of a wolf. But as we made our way deeper into the forest, the sound seemed to fade away, swallowed by an eerie, oppressive stillness. The air felt heavier somehow, the kind of weight that settles in your chest and whispers that you're not welcome. Our first night in the wild was uneventful, at least at first. We set up camp near a small clearing surrounded by towering spruce trees. The sunset painted the sky in fairy shades of orange and purple, and for a moment, the unease I'd been feeling seemed to fade. We shared stories around the fire, the crackling flames casting flickering shadows on the tree trunks. But then, just as we were settling in for the night, we heard it, a sound that didn't belong. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible, like the distant crunch of footsteps on dry leaves. I froze, my ears straining to pick up more. The others must have noticed my reaction, because the chatter around the fire stopped abruptly. Probably just an animal, I said, trying to sound casual. But my mind was racing. Bears, wolves, moose, they're all common in these parts, but I knew those sounds. This was different. The footsteps came again, closer this time. Slow, deliberate. Too heavy to be a fox, too cautious to be a moose. "Did you hear that?" Emma whispered, her voice barely audible. Marcus scoffed. "Relax. It's probably just a deer. Nothing to worry about." But Claire wasn't convinced. She was staring into the darkness beyond the firelight, her eyes wide. "Doesn't sound like a deer," she said, her voice trembling. I stood up, grabbing my flashlight. "Stay here," I told them, my tone leaving no room for argument. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness as I stepped beyond the circle of firelight. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees standing like silent sentinels. The sound had stopped, but the uneasy feeling in my gut only grew stronger. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small against the vast emptiness of the woods. Silence. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the flashlight casting long shadows that danced eerily with every small movement of my hand. Finally, I turned back toward the camp, forcing myself to act like nothing was wrong. When I returned, the group was huddled closer to the fire, their faces pale. "Nothing out there," I lied, taking my seat. "Probably just the wind," but deep down, I knew it wasn't the wind. And as I lay in my tent that night, staring up at the dark fabric above me, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching us. That was just the beginning. The second day began under a sky that felt too heavy, too low, as if it were pressing down on us. The air had a stillness to it, a quiet that wasn't natural, even for the wilderness. Birds didn't sing, leaves didn't rustle. It was as though the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting. We broke camp early, everyone eager to leave behind the unease of the previous night. The group tried to joke, to distract themselves, but their laughter was brittle. I kept my eyes on the trail ahead, but my ears stayed tuned to the forest, straining for any sound that might explain the strange noises we'd heard. There was nothing, just silence. By mid-morning, we came across the first sign, if you could call it that. A tree tall and gnarled stood at the edge of our path. Its bark was scored with deep grooves, as if something with massive claws had raked it in fury. "What the hell did that?" muttered Jake, the overconfident hiker, his bravado faltering for the first time. "Probably a bear." I lied, though the marks were too high, too deliberate. My gut churned, but I couldn't let them see that. The folklore enthusiast Laura leaned in closer. "Or the tornit," she whispered, half joking but clearly unnerved. "What's a tornit?" asked Rachel, the youngest and most nervous of the group. Laura launched into the story, her voice low and dramatic. She spoke of an ancient Inuit legend about a race of beings who lived in the wilderness, tall and powerful, with a hatred for humans who encroached on their land. "They don't leave survivors," she finished, her eyes gleaming with a mix of fear and excitement. "That's just a story," I snapped, harsher than I intended. "Let's keep moving." But as we pressed on, the forest began to feel wrong. We stopped for lunch in a clearing, but no one was hungry. The shadows here were too long, too dark, even though the sun was still high. I took a mental inventory of the group. Jake's swagger was gone, replaced by a restless energy. Laura kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see something lurking behind us. Rachel sat close to me, her wide eyes darting nervously around the clearing. That's when we noticed the first missing item, a backpack. It had been leaning against a tree just moments before, but now it was gone. Did someone move it? Rachel's voice was barely above a whisper. No one had. We searched the area, but there was no sign of the pack. No tracks, no disturbance in the underbrush. It was as if it had simply vanished. "Maybe an animal took it," Jake suggested, though even he didn't sound convinced. I didn't answer. My mind was racing, trying to reconcile what I knew about the wilderness with what we were experiencing. That night, the tension was palpable. We set up camp in a cluster, closer than usual, as if proximity could ward off whatever was out there. I stayed awake long after the others had fallen into an uneasy sleep. The fire cast flickering shadows on the trees, creating shapes that danced and twisted like specters. And then, just past midnight, I heard it again. The sound that had haunted us the night before. A low, guttural growl, too deep to belong to any animal I'd ever encountered. My heart pounded as I scanned the darkness, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the faintest rustle of leaves. I stepped away from the fire, moving toward the sound, though every instinct screamed at me to stay put. And then I saw it, just for a moment, a shadow darting between the trees. It was large, too large, and moved with an unnatural speed and grace. When I returned to the group, I found everyone awake, their faces pale. "What was that?" Rachel asked, her voice shaking. I didn't have an answer. I didn't know what to say. By dawn, we found more claw marks, deeper and more deliberate. Something, or someone, was marking its territory, warning us. But of what? Or why? The group's mood was fractured. Fear had settled into their bones, and I could feel it creeping into mine. I was the guide, the one who was supposed to have all the answers. But out here, with whatever this was stalking us, I felt powerless. As we packed up to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that something was out there, just beyond the trees, waiting. And I knew, deep down, that it wasn't done with us yet. The fire crackled weakly, its light barely stretching beyond the circle of our camp. The night pressed against us, dense and suffocating. It felt alive, like it had a pulse, a heartbeat that thrummed just beyond the veil of darkness. I sat by the fire, gripping the hilt of my hunting knife, the cold steel reassuring against my palm. My eyes darted toward the shadows as if I could catch something lurking there if I was fast enough. We had set up camp in a clearing surrounded by towering pines, their jagged silhouettes clawing at the starless sky. The others huddled closer together, their faces pale, their voices hushed. Even the wind had abandoned us. The air was unnaturally still. I wanted to tell them we'd be fine, that it was all explainable, but the words stuck in my throat. Something wasn't right. It hadn't been for days. The first sound came just as I was beginning to think we might make it through the night. A low, guttural growl, deep and resonant, vibrated through the clearing. It wasn't distant, like the sounds we'd been hearing before. This was close, too close. My pulse quickened as I scanned the darkness, every instinct screaming at me to run, but I couldn't. Not yet. Did you hear that? Emily's voice was a whisper, trembling and barely audible. Her wide eyes were fixed on me, searching for reassurance. I couldn't give it to her. Stay close to the fire, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. No one wanders off, no matter what. The growl came again, longer this time, reverberating through my chest. The sound was unnatural, almost mechanical, like it didn't belong to anything living. It circled us, moving with deliberate slowness, as if it was toying with us. Then, the scratching started. At first, it was faint, like branches dragging against bark, but soon it became louder, closer, sharp, deliberate, clawing against the trunks of the surrounding trees. One of the group, Paul, scrambled to his feet, panic etched across his face. "What the hell is that?" he shouted, his voice breaking. "Sit down," I snapped, my own fear sharpening my tone. Panicking won't help. Before I could say more, a branch snapped behind us, the sound like a gunshot in the silence. We all spun toward it, and for a moment, I thought I saw something, a flash of movement, too quick to make out. My breath caught. It was watching us, studying us. Then came the scream. It was Jason, the overconfident hiker who had been so sure this trip would be a cakewalk. He had wandered just outside the fire's glow, despite my warnings. His scream tore through the night, raw and primal. We saw him stumble back into the light, clutching his arm. His sleeve was shredded, dark blood soaking the fabric. "It's out there," he gasped, collapsing near the fire. It grabbed me. The group erupted into chaos. Emily cried. Paul yelled incoherent questions, and Jason's ragged breaths filled the air. I knelt beside him, my hands shaking as I inspected the wound. 3 deep gashes ran down his arm, too clean, too precise for a bear or a wolf. "Everyone stay close," I ordered, my voice louder now, more commanding. "We're not alone. We need to be ready for anything." The growl came again, this time from the opposite direction. Whatever it was fast. The scratching sounds returned, circling us like a predator stalking its prey. I felt the weight of responsibility crushing me. They were looking to me for answers, for safety, but I had none to give. I grabbed a flaming branch from the fire, holding it out like a torch. The flames flickered weakly, casting erratic shadows that made the darkness seem alive. "Keep the fire going. It doesn't like the light," I said, hoping it was true. And then it appeared, just for an instant, at the edge of the firelight. A hulking shadow, hunched and grotesque, its eyes glinting with an unnatural, malevolent light. It was gone as quickly as it had come, but the image burned itself into my mind. "Run," I whispered, the words slipping out before I could stop it. "We need to run. Now." "No," Paul protested. "We can't see out there. We'll—" A deafening roar cut him off, a sound so loud and guttural it seemed to shake the ground beneath us. The fire sputtered as a rush of wind tore through the clearing. "Move," I shouted, grabbing Jason and pushing him toward the trail we had come in on. The group stumbled after me, their faces pale with terror. The darkness seemed to close in around us, the growls and scratches following, relentless and unyielding. As we ran, I could hear Emily sobbing, Jason's ragged breathing, and the sound of whatever hunted us, always just behind. I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. We didn't stop until we reached the faint glow of dawn on the horizon. By then, we were battered, exhausted, and broken, but alive. For now. The morning light bulled weakly through the trees, casting long, skeletal shadows across the ground. I was the first to wake, my body aching and my mind replaying the chaos of the night before. Around me, the others lay in uneasy sleep, their faces pale and drawn, their breathing shallow. The air was heavy with a strange stillness, the kind that comes after a predator has fed and is waiting to strike again. We had survived, but I couldn't shake the feeling that survival was just another game we were being allowed to play. As I surveyed the camp, my eyes caught the remnants of our frantic escape. Claw marks gouged deep into the trunks of nearby trees. The shredded remnants of a tent flapping limply in the breeze. The ground was littered with overturned gear and footprints that weren't entirely ours. Some were too large, too oddly spaced, as though made by something that didn't quite belong. We needed to move. When the others woke, they didn't ask questions. The adrenaline from the night had burned away their skepticism, leaving behind only silent, haunted faces. We packed what little we could salvage and started our trek back towards civilization, the forest closing in around us like a living, breathing thing. It was mid-afternoon when we stumbled upon it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the way the shadows seemed to cling to the clearing ahead. But as we approached, the outlines became unmistakable, an abandoned campsite. The tents were flattened, their fabric torn and rotting. A campfire pit sat cold and empty, surrounded by scattered belongings. Pots, sleeping bags, even a pair of boots that looked eerily new. And then there was the smell. It was faint but unmistakable decay, mingled with something sharp and metallic. Blood. The group hesitated, whispering nervously, but I forced myself to step forward. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, to leave this place untouched, but I couldn't. I had to know. In the center of the site was a journal, its cover weathered and stained. I picked it up, the pages brittle under my fingers. The entries were short, scrawled in a hurried, panicked hand. Something's out there, watching us. Every night it gets closer, We tried to leave, but it's hurting us, cutting off every path. If anyone finds this, please don't stay. Don't let it see you. The final page was torn, the writing smudged with what I could only hope wasn't blood. A sharp snap of a branch jolted me back to the present. My head whipped around, heart pounding, but the forest was as silent as before. The others were frozen, their wide eyes scanning the tree line. "We need to go," I said, my voice a low, urgent whisper. The walk back was torturous. Every step felt heavier, every shadow more menacing. The forest seemed to close in tighter the further we went, as if it were alive, pushing us towards some unseen end. By the time we reached the ranger station, the sun was beginning to set. The small, weathered building stood like a beacon of salvation, though its windows were dark and its doors locked. We pounded on them anyway, desperate and frantic, until an older ranger finally opened the door, his face lined with equal parts annoyance and concern. We told him everything, or at least tried to. Words felt hollow against the weight of what we had experienced. He listened with a stoic expression, his eyes flicking occasionally to the dense woods behind us. "You're lucky to be alive," was all he said when we finished. That night, as the group huddled inside, I stepped out for a breath of fresh air. The cool Alaskan breeze, cutting through the remnants of my fear. The stars were beginning to pierce the twilight sky, their light cold and distant. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl carried on the wind. It was distant, but unmistakable, echoing through the trees like a promise. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to believe it was a bear or a wolf, anything but what my mind told me it was. But deep down I knew, whatever it was still out there, and it wasn't finished with us.